Great. Thank you, Ari. And thanks, everyone. I'm very thankful to the organizers of CIPHER 2023 for inviting me. So I'm very happy for the opportunity, very happy to be here. And I thank everybody who's here, also everybody who is joining online, including some of my colleagues from the University of Michigan and elsewhere. So very happy to be talking about this today. I have up here on the first slide my email address. So I'm going to be talking about a project that we've been working on in Michigan that's very relevant to this conference, but I would love to hear additional feedback and have ongoing discussions by email if anybody would like to shoot me an email. So you can see that up here on the main slide. So my title today is moving from a national probability-based push-to-web survey to an online probability-based panel. What are the issues? So I'm going to talk about some of our experiences at Michigan in trying to pull something like this off in the framework of an R01. So I think that's what's unique about this particular project is we sought to pull this off within the framework of R01 funding, which gives us basically a 3 to 5 year period, about $500,000 a year to get something like this off the ground, with the idea being that somebody else could pull off this kind of data collection in the R01 framework without the resources of some of the larger projects that we hear about. And so I'm going to be talking about what we learned in the context of that kind of opportunity to apply for funding. So I just want to plant that seed to begin with, that this is in a resource restricted environment that a lot of this took place. Okay, so I do want to acknowledge support from the NIH for what I'm going to be introducing as the American Family Health Study, or AFHS. Again, this was all funded by a grant from the NICHD, of which I am the PI. I also want to point out on this slide, we have the website for the AFHS up here. So if you'd like to visit that website and learn more about the project and what we're finding and what we're learning and moving forward, feel free to visit that website. And again, I'd be happy to hear about any comments or suggestions or thoughts about the project. I also want to thank my colleagues on the AFHS team, some of whom, again, are joining or even here today. Mick Cooper, Bill Axon, James Wagner, Rebecca Gatward, Colette Kaiser, Andrew Hupp, Taewa Saw, and Xiu Zhang, along with several other staff members from the Survey Research Operations team at the University of Michigan who made this all happen. So I'm very grateful to all my colleagues who really, helped me and the team really pull this off. And like I said, we've learned a lot, but none of it would have happened without the support of my tremendous colleagues here. So I want to thank them to begin. So why push to web on a national scale? So let's start with a discussion of push to web. As we all know, large scale face-to-face data collections have rising costs, combined with rising non-response rates, and general reluctance of the public to participate in very time-consuming in-person data collections. All of this combines to really threaten the future of national face-to-face surveys. And, we also had this kind of triple whammy of the COVID-19 pandemic, which further eroded people's confidence and reliance on face-to-face surveys. So all of this is combined to create a really urgent need for the evaluation of innovative web-based data collection methods that are both convenient for the general public and also yield high quality scientific information for population researchers. So we're really trying to meet all of these goals with the data collection strategies that we're all working on and researching and innovating. But there's a really strong need for more developments in these areas. So I love to hear about everything that's going on, and what we've heard about so far today has just been fantastic. So what's the solution? The development of an alternative data collection methodology is really important for research teams, again, that don't have the resources of larger government agencies that are conducting these large scale, massive data collection projects. And doing this, again, within funding constraints that are available to a given researcher or a small research team. How can we try to pull that stuff off? So I really liked hearing about the LA Barometer study, because that kind of local work, again, within funding constraints is really important. And I think there needs to be a lot more of that. So we really wanted to explore, how can we do this kind of high quality work without these kinds of large scale resources? And the web mode, of course, is particularly appealing because it's relatively inexpensive and it affords a high level of privacy and confidentiality when it's correctly implemented. So what I'm going to be talking about today is initial results about what we've learned from a sequential mixed mode webmail data collection approach that we implemented on a national probability sample from 2020 to 2022. So what's unique about this is we were able to collect this kind of large scale data during the pandemic when many face-to-face operations had to shut down. And we're going to compare the results from this study to a benchmark face-to-face national survey of population health, which is the 2017 to 2019 National Survey of Family Growth. We're just using this particular set of data from the NSFG as a benchmark because it's closest in time in terms of what's publicly available right now to the 2020 to 2022 period. And I'll keep coming back to this in terms of the comparisons and whether we really have apples to apples based on that difference in the timeframes. But of course, we have some colleagues from NCHS here, so I will be very interested to hear their thoughts as well about these comparisons with the NSFG. But that's not all I'm talking about. And, you know, Michigan is playing against Rutgers right now, so we're all under time constraints. But there is going to be more. We attempted to take this data collection one step further, and we followed up with respondents to gauge their willingness to become part of a new online panel that would feature monthly measurement. So that's really where we're getting with the relevance, I think, for CIPHER. And what I want to address is what are the critical issues that come from attempting to form an online probability-based panel in this way. So that's a lot of what I'm going to focus on with the AFHS as kind of a starting point. So we had 4 objectives in evaluating this kind of baseline push to web approach with a national probability sample. First of all, we wanted to evaluate the features of the respondents recruited using this approach and the population that they would represent prior to any weighting adjustments. So in other words, how much help do we need from the weighting adjustments when using this kind of approach? Second, we wanted to compare survey estimates based on this webmail approach to those computed from the NSFG, measuring the same health content in a similar time frame. So I mentioned this 3 to 5 year time frame for an R01. Literally 2 years of that time frame, we're translating the NSFG content to a web environment. Okay, so that was a tremendous undertaking. And so we really want to compare estimates that are based on more or less the exact same measures, only collected in a web environment as opposed to via face-to-face data collection. Third, we want to evaluate design effects on the survey estimates due to the complex probability sampling designs that were employed in each of these cases. So the AFHS used an address-based sampling approach where we selected an address-based sample of households. But a key distinction from some of the other projects we've heard about is there was a very complex screening operation for this particular study. We needed to identify households with individuals between the ages of 18 and 49. So this was really a 2-stage data collection. First of all, we had to screen the households. Then we had to try to follow up and collect the main survey data. And again, this was all done within the constraints of an R01. Okay, so that's the key point here. And then finally, we wanted to compare the data collection costs per completed survey that were associated with these 2 different approaches, face-to-face versus a sequential mixed mode webmail approach. So here's a summary of the design of the AFHS. We recently completed the data collection with a national address-based probability sample of about 40,000 US addresses. And we split the 40,000 sampled addresses into 2 national sample replicates. So we conducted the first data collection, took a step back, understood what we did well, what we didn't do well, refined the design for the second replicate, and then we implemented those improved procedures in the second replicate. Then we put everything together and developed overall weights for the overall data set. We used, again, a sequential mixed mode protocol that involved push to web and mail follow-up at both the screening and the main data collection stages that I alluded to. So we had a sequential mixed mode protocol for both the screening operation and the main data collection phase of the overall project. At no point were an interviewers involved in any way. That's the other key point here. Everything was web mail. Okay, and I'll talk about some of the follow-up strategies that we used, but no interview involvement at any point because an R01 cannot pay for that. Okay. We also experimented with modular design. So for purposes of this analysis that I'm talking about, data from the modular and the full surveys were combined, as overall in that experiment, we found very few differences in the measures collected when using a modular design approach, because the NSFG is a fairly long interview. It can take between 40 to 80 minutes. When you translate that to web, it might not take as long, but it's still a very lengthy web survey. So we tried to split it up into pieces, but we found very few differences in measurement between those people doing it in a modular fashion and those people just sitting through the entire web survey and taking breaks as needed. So I'm just going to be talking about the combined results from that overall experiment. So at the screening stage, I mentioned this is kind of a two-phase project here. So at the screening stage, what we did is we first sent an invitation letter with a web link and a $2 prepaid incentive. Okay, so we had the kind of traditional $2 bill within the initial mailed invitations. We then sent a reminder postcard, including that same web link 1 week later. And then a reminder letter with a paper screener was included 2 weeks after that. So we gave them the option of providing the screening information via paper 2 weeks after that postcard was mailed out. In the first replicate, we then took a random subsample of 5,000 non-respondents, okay, after those initial 3 attempts, and they received a 4th priority mailing in a different envelope in a priority mailer with an additional $5 incentive included. And you can find the results of that experiment described more in this paper by James Wagner and colleagues in 2022. I'll provide the reference list at the end. But we wanted to see if that additional incentive, along with the priority mailing, would help to bring in some of these non-respondents to the screening invitation. So keep in mind, this is all just the screening phase. We're not talking about the main data collection yet. In the second replicate, we looked at those results and we said, well, we found a really good benefit of doing that, but we're not sure if it was the priority mailer or if it was the $5. So we designed an experiment where 70% of the non-respondents at that same stage received that combination. 10% received only the priority mailing without the $5. 10% received only the $5 in a smaller envelope, and 10% didn't receive anything. So we designed an experiment with those 4 groups, putting most of the emphasis on what we found worked well, but trying to decompose that effect and see what really worked best in that sense. And we wanted to try to identify what the primary effects were. That paper is now coming out as well. Our wonderful PhD student, Xiu Zhang, has published that. It's coming out in JSSAM. So I'll show you that reference as well. So again, that's all just screening. That's the whole point of this, is to collect via web and mail household rosters, where we can then randomly select somebody from those completed household rosters to follow up with, again, all via web and mail. Okay, so then to the main protocol, we sent an invitation letter to that randomly selected individual from the rostering that included a web link to complete the full survey, or a module if they were assigned to the modular design group. And the promised incentive was up to $70. So if they were in a modular group, they could do 3 different modules, getting 30 for the first, 20 for the second, and 20 for the third. If they were in the full survey group and they just did the whole survey at once, they would get $70. So I say up to because people didn't complete all 3 modules necessarily. Some people only completed the first module or only the first and second modules, but maybe not necessarily all 3. They've then received a reminder postcard or an email if they had provided an email address previously during screening, 2 weeks after that initial invitation letter. Then they received a shorter paper version of the questionnaire or the module mailed 4 weeks after that with a web reminder. So the paper version of the questionnaire only collected measures that didn't require complex logic or complex skip patterns. So the paper version of the questionnaire did not have all the same measures that were in the full web instrument. Okay, just because that particular questionnaire, as I'll say a little bit more about, very complex skip patterns, measurement processes, very difficult to implement that on paper. So we really only collected questions that didn't require any kind of filtering. A lot of the key statistics there on paper. So it was a much shorter version that they had the option of completing. Now, if they still, keep in mind, these are people who had responded to the screener. Okay, they'd provide us with their information. If they still hadn't responded to the main survey invitation at that point, here we had telephone reminders, not telephone interviewing, but telephone reminders. So we had staff calling this small subset of individuals who had not yet responded, simply reminding them, hey, did you get the mail? Did you get these invitations? Are you having any problems accessing this on the web? Just to follow up and say, you know, are you planning to complete this? Are there any issues we can help you with, but not actually administering the survey? That was the key point here. So this could be handled by a small number of calling staff in our phone lab, just to get these reminders across to the people who still hadn't responded to the main invitation at this point. Now, the phone numbers came from the completed screening questionnaires or from linked data from Marketing Systems Group. Okay, so you know, you can say what you want about the quality of those commercial data. We found them to be helpful in this particular case. The primary point I want to make here, though, is that this idea of following up in this sequential mixed mode protocol simply with telephone reminders and not to do the actual interviewing was incredibly effective. It increased our response rates by 15 to 20 percentage points, not percentage points at this phase of the data collection. So it's a very, very effective technique. It's also very cost efficient. Okay, in the context of this kind of protocol. Again, all of this under an R01 cap. Okay, so, you know, we have David here kind of looking at a web survey and saying, what in God's name, you want me to sit here and respond to a web surveys for 60 minutes? So those of you who don't watch Schitt's Creek, I apologize. That probably went right over your head, but the whole point here is, holy mackerel, that's a 60-minute web survey. So what did the response rates look like? In replicate one, we obtained a response rate in the screening stage of 15%. So in total, we had 2,523 respondents. And then a conditional RR4 response rate of 66% in the main stage. Okay, so in the end, we had a total of 980 respondents after both of those stages. The final combined APOR conditional response rate 4 was 9.9% from the first replicate across the screening and the main stages. Okay, in replicate 2, where we made some of these enhancements, the screening stage response rate was 17.8%. So we got 3,617 completed screeners. And then we achieved a conditional APOR 4 response rate of 62.4 in the main stage. So in the second replicate, the final APOR RR4 was 11.1%. Furthermore, we found that 89% of the AFHS respondents participated via web. The remaining 11% were those who returned the shortened paper questionnaire. So clearly the first issue that I want to raise is that we do see still low response rates in this kind of cold recruitment of an initial national sample using web and mail modes only with no form of interview or follow-up. Okay, that's the key point here. Outside again of those telephone reminders in the non-response follow-up for the main stage. So this is certainly an issue to grapple with. You know, we're talking about somewhere between 10 and 11% as an overall response rate. What kind of bias does that introduce in terms of the responses? And that's what we want to look at. So objective number one that I talked about this evaluation was representation. The AFHS tended to recruit more respondents that were non-Hispanic white and higher educated. And this was the case for both males and females. The male respondents in the AFHS also tended to be a little bit younger than what was seen in the NSFG, although this difference tended to be a little bit weaker. And again, we were using the NSFG as a benchmark for this kind of data collection. So while these findings certainly aren't unique to the AFHS, they do imply that there's still going to be some weighting adjustment needed. So I really like Yulei's earlier presentation that saying that calibration adjustment is still a very important factor in working with these kinds of online probability-based samples. So these non-response adjustments to the base sampling weights for the probability sampling may be needed to correct for these potential biases due to race, ethnicity, and education. But again, whether there would be bias in estimates due to these differentials depends on whether or not those are strong predictors of what we tried to collect in the AFHS. So now thinking about the key estimates, which speaks to that question, we identified 42 and 89 key measures in the male and female surveys respectively. So males and females got different sets of content. This is a survey of family formation and reproductive health and health behaviors. So males and females each get separate instruments in this data collection. And we really identified these 131 measures based on key statistics and variables that have often been analyzed in the literature as being generated by the NSFG. So we wanted to see again how these lined up with each other in the overall comparison. Both of the AFHS and the NSFG estimates were weighted by the final survey weights associated with each study. And we computed design adjusted standard errors to account for the complex sampling features of each probability sample. We wanted to look at the similarity of estimates based on their standard errors, their confidence intervals, and then we also looked at changes in the estimates across the 4 stages of that protocol. So did it seem like parts of the protocol were really helping in terms of correcting the bias that we were seeing in these estimates? We also wanted to see whether the web and the mail respondents in the AFHS varied in terms of their response distributions. So in general, we found that the weighting adjustments applied to the AFHS estimates were much more effective at shifting the estimates closer to what we found in the NSFG than was the sequential mixed mode design. The sequential mixed mode design really served best to just increase yield. It didn't necessarily offset biases. That was the key finding here. So weighting was really much more effective than the different data collection options at each phase of the main stage at reducing these biases. Okay. And as we might expect, weighting did tend to increase the standard errors a little bit. So the more reliance there is on weights, we have that possible risk in terms of design effects. But a cool thing that we found was that the weighted estimates based on the full sample were quite similar to those based on the web subsample. So that says that what's coming in from the web is not really changing that much when we add in the mail respondents. So if we focus exclusively on web, it seems like we're more or less getting the same thing. In general, as kind of the key takeaway point, what was really cool was that the AFHS and the NSFG estimates were very well aligned. So I'm going to show you some figures coming from that, despite the low response rate. So if key estimates differ as a third issue based on web measurement as compared to interviewer administration, like in the NSFG, what are the mechanisms behind that? And might repeated measurement as being part of an online panel ultimately introduce some kind of conditioning, reducing data quality further? So I'm going to come back to that point when we talk about following up with these individuals. But I want to show you some visuals that kind of indicate this general alignment of the estimates with what we saw in NSFG. Now, there's no way that you're going to read every single variable label that's on this y-axis that you see here. This is all part of the paper that I can share with anybody who's interested. The point is to see the general consistency and alignment of the estimates. I've circled a few that were way off from each other. And this is for females. So there's a variety of different estimated proportions for females. You can see the general alignment of the estimates with each other on a scale of 0 to 1 on the x-axis, as you see here. And so I'll talk more about some of those circled estimates that don't necessarily line up with each other. But in general, when you look across all these proportions, despite that between 10 and 11% response rate, you see the general alignment of the estimates and the confidence intervals in this case. And you might say, well, why would the confidence intervals be similar? It's because in the AFHS address-based probability sample, we don't have to draw a cluster sample, right? There's no interviewer administration. So we don't need to sample areas to which we send interviewers. That sample can be purely stratified. We don't need to worry about cluster sampling. That was a big finding here. Here's the same picture for male estimates. So this is a variety of male proportions, general alignment. Again, I've circled a couple where there were notable differences that I'll come back to, but in general, alignment between these different estimates for a variety of different types of key statistics that were measured in the National Survey of Family Growth. Here we look at estimates of means for both females and males. Again, same general message. I'll point out some features of both of these where there were differences, but generally agreements between the estimates produced from the two studies. Now, when there were differences, when you look at the individual variables where there were differences and you scrutinize them a little bit more, it did seem like these differences were arising from measures that may have been affected by the pandemic. Again, because the bulk of our data collection occurred during the pandemic, whereas obviously 2017 to 2019 NSFG occurred prior. So for example, if you look among males, the mean number of months working for pay in the past year was noticeably lower in the AFHS. Was this possibly a function of this so-called Great Resignation that was occurring during the pandemic? Use of birth control and emergency contraception among females also declined significantly in the AFHS, possibly due to some of the changing social circumstances that were being introduced by the pandemic. And I refer to a paper by Axon et al. That goes into more detail about that. Reports of excellent health and ever being tested for HIV also declined significantly for both males and females in the AFHS relative to the NSFG, possibly reflecting poor health during the pandemic and less in-person medical visits for clinical testing. Or I raised the option, was this simply more honest reporting via the web? The idea that we're getting mode effects, in this particular case, less social desirability. Here's a big one. I mentioned earlier, no cluster sampling in the AFHS in the initial recruitment. This is a distribution of the design effects that were observed across all 131 of those estimates, okay? What you see in blue is the distribution of design effects based on the NSFG. What you see in orange is the distribution of design effects based on the AFHS. Clearly, the unnecessary cluster, well, the lack of a need to select a cluster sample if you're using a strictly webmail approach substantially reduces design effects. So that's a key point here. And we kind of expected that going in, but it was nice to actually see that demonstrated here. Fourth objective was costs. So based on data from the last 4 quarters of the 2017 to 2019 NSFG, the AFHS produced significant cost savings per completed survey. We found that per respondent, the AFHS costed about $300 less per completed survey, including that $70 incentive that we were offering to everybody. So if you think about these average design effects of 3 and 1.5 for NSFG and AFHS, the estimated cost per effective sample size were about 2,151 in the NSFG and about 626 in the AFHS. So another positive advantage in terms of cost efficiency with this kind of webmail approach. So just to kind of summarize the findings here from this initial evaluation of the benchmark, the webmail approach did recruit more non-Hispanic white and higher educated individuals, and careful weighting approaches would hopefully compensate for this potential source of non-response bias. About 3/4 of the estimates were statistically similar to those produced by the NSFG, with the remaining 1/4 likely having shifts introduced by the pandemic. Design effects on the variances of estimates due to the complex sampling were a fraction of those found in the NSFG, largely owing to the absence of area cluster sampling for the purely webmail approach. And the cost per completed survey was about $300 less in the webmail approach compared to the NSFG when considering all of the data collection activities. That's nice, but we're at CIPHER. So what about panels, right? I've just talked about a cross-sectional data collection so far. So what about the whole panel aspect of this? Well, again, within the R01 constraints, we designed a small web survey to follow up with AFHS respondents from the replicate 2 data collection. Here I raise the question, is that still a probability sample? With an 11% response rate, are we really still talking about a probability sample? To gauge their interest in becoming part of a national web panel that would receive monthly survey requests for surveys on reproductive health and family formation, largely to create novel short-term longitudinal data on these topics. So the overarching question here was, when you attempt to form a probability-based panel based on this kind of fresh recruitment of households from a national address-based probability sample that has already participated in this kind of cross-sectional webmail survey, who ultimately is willing to participate? And another one of our wonderful graduate students, Tewa Saw, has now written a brief report on what we found here. That's under second review at Field Methods as of right now. So here was the design of this follow-up study. All of the respondents in the second AFHS replicate were invited to participate in the follow-up survey in July of 2022, and they were offered an additional $10 to complete the follow-up survey. This survey collected information on willingness to participate in these future AFHS type, data collections, family planning measures, financial expectations, and mental well-being. So we did add in some substantive measures to the follow-up study just to see if we could answer some other questions related to these measures. The binary outcome variable we were most interested in was an indicator of responding to the follow-up survey and being willing to participate in the follow-up surveys. In other words, become part of the panel. And we wanted to use the AFHS data collected in Replicate 2 to try and predict this willingness, okay, to understand what kinds of people would want to be involved in the panel. So the predictor variables that we looked at included demographics, all the common ones that we're familiar with, substantive AFHS measures that were, first of all, asked of both males and females on both web and on paper. So we weren't throwing anybody out. Measures that were not part of branching questions, and measures that were considered key variables by the NSFG. So things like, have you ever had sex? Were your biological parents married at the time of birth? Were you ever married? Do you have health insurance? Things of that sort. So we wanted to use those as predictors of willingness to join the panel. Auxiliary information we considered as well, the date completing the AFHS survey. Okay, so how long has it been since they completed the second replicate survey, and the time that they were invited to complete the follow-up study. The non-response follow-up phase that they reached in the AFHS screening and main surveys to see if more difficult individuals were less willing to participate, the number of people in the household, the completion mode for the AFHS, and whether they received visible cash in a prior experiment that we did in AFHS. So that was another experimental factor. And then whether they consented to receive text messages in the original AFHS. So a variety of paradata and auxiliary information as well. So we first looked at pairwise correlations and associations among all these candidate predictors to try and eliminate any predictors that were essentially redundant and only retain those predictors that were mostly orthogonal to each other. Any missing values on the individual predictors were kept as their own classes, so we didn't just discard because of missing values. And we fit a multivariable logistic regression model to estimate the relationships of each of these retained predictor variables with that binary outcome that I mentioned previously. The overall sample size was 1,334, and we found pretty good fit of this model. So the area under the curve was about 0.7. So what did we find in terms of the most important predictors? The adjusted odds of responding and expressing willingness to join this kind of panel data collection increased significantly for individuals with college degrees and above, non-Hispanic whites again, so same story, okay? Higher educated individuals, non-Hispanic whites, individuals with health insurance, those responding later in the second AFHS replicate. So in other words, less time had elapsed between when they participated in the initial data collection and when they were invited to participate in the follow-up panel. Those who did not receive follow-up telephone calls for reminders in the AFHS main stage. So again, people who were more cooperative earlier in the main data collection protocol, and those who consented to receive text messages as a part of the AFHS. So they're more willing to be contacted in different ways. So a mix of higher socioeconomic status and then indicators in the paradata of being more cooperative in the initial data collection. So issue 4, which I would call likely the most important for CIPHER, is that efforts to create a national web panel by following up with initial respondents to some national cross-sectional web mail survey data collection effort may introduce potential selection bias in estimates based on the panel respondents. And remember, this assumes that initial weights have done the job of removing any initial selection bias coming from the 11% response rate, right? So we're waiting on top of waiting, and that's certainly a potential issue here. Panel recruitment of this form may result in more cooperative individuals with higher socioeconomic status, meaning that alternative recruitment strategies may be needed for other types of individuals. So differential incentives, tailored materials, telephone reminders, selected in-person follow-up. Like I absolutely love what Amerispeak does. I love their entire recruitment protocol and I'm envious of it. But the hope would be that that kind of recruitment protocol with additional resources might work. But again, we wanted to see what could be done within an R01 cap. Design modifications should come first, of course. We want to try to attack these issues by design, but additional weighting adjustments may still be needed, especially if the estimates based on the panel still seem to have bias after the weights have been adjusted further. So I think these are some of the more prominent issues with this kind of approach. So one idea that Tewa has is thinking about a randomized experiment. What if we started a panel from scratch without first pulling off this baseline survey? So is this feasible when you're using only web and mail recruitment? I think that's an experiment worth conducting at some point. What about asking people about their interest to join a panel immediately after the baseline survey is completed? We didn't do that. We did that as a form of a follow-up study in this case. You could also design an experiment to look at the effectiveness of this kind of approach. So again, there's less time elapsed between completing the initial survey and then being asked to participate in the follow-up study. And then in general, just more use of adaptive design based on predictive modeling of sample member attributes and figuring out what types of protocols might work the best for particular individuals based on what we've learned from past data collections. So I think now that we have these 2 replicates done of the AFHS, we're starting to analyze some of the data a little bit more and try to understand what worked, what didn't work, and what we might like to try doing in the future. So, okay, so just to summarize the issues in conclusion, I think the first major issue is low response rates to an initial baseline survey, possibly due to screening. Not all studies are going to involve screening, but looking at additional incentives, priority mail, visible cache, and telephone reminders, we found that all of these design features really did help a lot in terms of that initial screening phase. So I think those are very important to consider. Second issue, weights may need to do a lot of work that sequential mixed mode protocols cannot, to help reduce non-response bias. But again, these telephone reminders can be very helpful at the main data collection stage. Third issue, does the web introduce measurement differences relative to in-person administration? And if so, what are the underlying mechanisms here? And does panel conditioning ultimately emerge if we repeatedly measure these individuals as part of a panel? And then the fourth, and I think most important issue is among respondents to that initial baseline study, those willing to participate in the frequent follow-up surveys as part of a panel tended to have higher SES. They tend to complete the initial data collection more recently. They tend to be more cooperative in general. How can we best recruit other types of individuals to avoid this kind of selection bias and reduce the lift of the kinds of weighting adjustments that Yulei was talking about earlier? I think that's really, really critical. Okay, so here are some of the references to the papers that I've mentioned. Again, more than happy to share drafts of any of these papers or the accepted versions of these papers at any point. We have a number of papers in the hopper right now. Again, now that we're trying to analyze some of the data from AFHS and really kind of summarize everything that we've learned. So would be more than happy to share any of these papers. Just shoot me an email. And again, I want to say thanks to the CIPHER organizers for inviting me. It's a really nice opportunity. So really happy to be here today and more than happy to answer any questions as long as they still leave time for me to see what the score is. Okay, thank you.